So my name is Jerry Campbell. I'm a former senior commander from the Metropolitan Police in London. I was a detective chief superintendent. I was in policing for 30 years. I led a number of high-profile commands in London and led a number of high-risk operations in London and some of which then across Europe. I was the Deputy National Policing Lead for honour-based abuse, forced marriage, and FGM. So providing guidance and direction to the 43 police forces in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. I've worked since leaving policing. I've worked with a number of different UN entities and with international development companies in different jurisdictions. More recently, in on the ground in Ukraine, Bangladesh, Jordan, Egypt, in Mogadishu, in Somalia, and in undertaking that work, the vast majority of which was directly connected to rule of law, access to justice, tackling and responding to gender-based violence and conflict-related sexual violence. I've authored with friends a couple of books with a focus on honour-based abuse, gender-based violence, the policing responses to those subject areas. I would say gender responsive policing is mission critical. It's mission critical because gender responsive policing is effectively a framework, it's an ethos of how police and law enforcement agencies should interact with and engage the wider community and ensure that no woman, girl, boy, or man, or including wider marginalised communities, are left behind in the delivery of policing services to wider community members. So how police officers engage, how they investigate, how they respond is absolutely critical. Taking a fair human rights, justice-based approach to the community is absolutely critical. Always in policing and in law enforcement, it is how you deliver your services, which leaves a lasting impact, a lasting impression on a victim or survivor, a witness, even a perpetrator, their family members, and the wider community. So I'll go back to my initial comments. I see it as absolutely mission critical that the police get it right and take a very inclusive approach to the delivery of their services. But of course, it is not solely about how the police and law enforcement deliver services to the community. It's incredibly important that they adopt the gender responsive policing principles inside their organizations as well. How they treat one another, how they recruit, coach and develop, manage, promote to higher ranks, or diversify and encourage both women and men to diversify into more specialized teams, whether it's firearms teams, SWAT teams, investigation teams, is absolutely critical. We need police officers, women and men, who have got a blend of skills, who bring their knowledge, their skills, their personalities, and we bring together all of those knowledge, skills, and experiences to develop formidable teams, to develop formidable investigation teams and operational response teams in major crime units, so that the police officers can be the best that they can be. Gender responsive policing is about improving and increasing operational effectiveness to provide the best possible service to the wider community, to victims and survivors. I think it's important really to identify, firstly, the wider subject area of gender-based violence and gender-based violence of women and girls specifically, and violence against women and girls, and then where technology facilitated violence against women and girls fits into that. What we've got to be absolutely clear about is that gender-based violence of women and girls it is about the targeting and the victimization of women and girls based on their gender. So this is physical, sexual, psychological, emotional, economic abuse of women and girls based on the fact that they are because of their gender. And of course, what we also see then is coercive and controlling behavior. And in amongst all of this, then we then also see then the technology facilitated offending. Okay. And of course, studies will tell us that anywhere between 16 and 58% of women and girls have been exposed to, in other words, they have been victimized through the use of technology. And of course, which then fundamentally means that given the increasing digitalization in our daily lives, and then the improvements to that digitalization, whether it's through artificial intelligence or the improvements in technology and so forth. I mean, quite sadly, whilst that is a positive, there's also a significant cloud over that. The cloud being that offenders who are acutely aware and adept and skilled in the use of technology will use that knowledge and that experience and those skill sets to target either individuals or to target women and girls in a wider sense. So what we're saying is that digital offending is not just about potentially offending whilst it's serious, offending against an individual. We're seeing a singular offender offending against hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of women and girls, targeting them from behind the screen and a keyboard, and then targeting those women and girls. But targeting the women and girls in some of the places that they should feel the safest, which is in their own bedrooms, in their own homes. So effectively, there is sometimes no getting away from these offenders. But the technology facilitated offending is also connected to organized criminal networks. So we see organized criminals who are blackmailing primarily, but not exclusively, women and girls. We see men and young men being exposed to blackmail and extortion through something which has become known as sextortion in some jurisdictions, where there's an exchange potentially of private and intimate images. And then the organized criminals are using that exchange of images to then blackmail and extort money from victims. And we have seen right across the globe, as I said, primarily but not exclusively, young people, both girls and boys self-harming, and sadly, some people going on to take their own lives. If we look at the gravity and the scale of the offending and the psychological and the emotional torture that the young person is going through, because the threat is those images are going to be made public. Their family, their friends, their neighbours. It could be their religious group they might be part of, their youth group, or their employers and their co-workers being exposed to those intimate images. And seriously, we've got to seriously ask ourselves the questions about that turmoil and this psychological impact on a victim that has got them into such a place that takes them to taking their own lives. That tells us, that surely this has got to tell us something about the urgency of the situation. Surely this has got to tell us something, whether it's key decision makers in policing, investigators, to the large tech companies. This should tell us something, that we've got to take a multi-sectoral approach to this scourge, this global scourge, that is about protecting life, that is about saving young people, and is about tackling dangerous and violent offenders that are using technology and other methodology to target either a single victim, but more likely to be multiples and tens of thousands of victims for financial gain, but significant loss to individuals, to families and friends. That should tell us something about the urgency of the situation. It should also be a key signpost to uh, to governments about having the right legislation in place. It should also tell governments about the need to work with big tech companies. It should also talk about capacity building in police organizations and in intelligence and information structures, and the exchange of information between organizations and with different jurisdictions, because of the global nature of the offending. And of course, the global nature of the offending sadly also helps the offenders because of the multi-jurisdictional element to this, where there's different laws apply, and whether the laws that govern information exchange and intelligence exchange acts or can act as a barrier to the sharing of information, to support investigations, and then ultimately to support the prosecution of offenders. In my 39, almost 40 years of professional experience, there's one thing it tells me about dangerous and violent offenders, and that's that those people will continue to offend unless there's a significant intervention point. And that significant intervention point invariably means they are arrested. They go into the court structure and they are convicted and put in prison for their offending. So it's telling me about the emergency that we have got in tackling gender-based violence, but also tackling the one of the elements to it in terms of the technology facilitated offending. And given the advancements, and we see quite clearly publicized and talked about the advancements in artificial intelligence, the use of deep fake. Yeah. So the real problem here is the controls around that. The real issue also is around investigators being keeping up with those changes, and their ability to keep up with those changes, and their ability not only to keep up with the changes, but to have sufficient resources and skilled and specialist investigators who can also keep up and advise on investigations. So there is no end of significant challenges ahead for policing and law enforcement and governments in this respect. Yeah, I do think there are a number of do's and don'ts in respect of this. Um, I think it's incredibly important that the police officers, when the police officers and police decision makers and forces have a clear strategy in place around prevention and around raising awareness for the wider community, and that the police at a strategic level have the multi-sectoral strategic partnerships and approach to prevention, deterrence, and raising awareness and educating and prosecution. I think that's really important at that kind of strategic level, and that they have got agreements, international agreements in place, like mutual legal assistance and agreements to exchange information and intelligence on offenders, and working with big tech company on information exchanges as well. At a more practical level, in terms of the first responder or the investigators in their engagement with victims and survivors, what is absolutely critical is that police officers treat technology facilitated offending as a serious offence, as a serious crime, that they treat it seriously, and that they inform the victim and survivor that they're treating it seriously, what they're doing, why they are doing it, and that we take certain key gender responsive policing principles and we bring them to bear, is that we are victim and survivor centered. We are trauma informed, that we respect the wishes and the confidentiality and the privacy of the victim and survivor, whilst also being, whilst we are being trauma informed, we are being culturally aware. We are being sensitive to the needs of the victims and survivors, and doing the best that we can to maximize the recovery of evidence from them, and working with and alongside them. But when we're doing that, principally, the principal role of policing is about safety and protection. So whilst the person has been victimized, the idea is to prevent further victimization and to ensure their protection and their safety. But one of the other key principles that we're working to is the do no harm principle. By the involvement and the engagement of the police and law enforcement, we can't make the victim and the survivor's position worse than it already is in accordance with their experiences. And this is why I mentioned earlier about how the police officers engage, how they speak and interact with the victim. Police officers shouldn't be speaking to victims and survivors in the presence of other family members, because it may be that one of the other family members could be part of the offending and could be part of the wider continuum of the GBV offending. In technology facilitated offending, we cannot assume that the offender, the perpetrator, is a stranger that the victim doesn't know. It could be another family member. It could be a neighbor. It could be a friend. We cannot make assumptions as part of investigations. But of course, we also want to create an environment where the victim, the survivor, feels confident that they can disclose private, very intimate and private details to the police investigator. And some of that could be about what some of the content could have been on mobile devices, the content which could have been shared. There could be intimate photographs. The victim and survivor doesn't want their family members to know this. So that confidence, that confidentiality space is absolutely critical. And also we progress investigations at the pace that is comfortable for the victim. Victims and survivors must also feel to be in control as well. But the police officer must give them confidence and reassurance that they're treating the investigation seriously, that they're doing all that they can to prevent this from happening, and doing all that they can to focus on the perpetrator as well. I think it's really important for investigators to understand that what an investigator wants as an outcome might not be shared by the victim and the survivor. Because a number of victim survivors says they just want the violence and the abuse and to stop. They don't want to go to court. They want to ensure that any images that have been shared have been absolutely destroyed, and that they don't want court proceedings. So respecting the wishes and working with the victims and survivors are really important. Another key thing that I found over the years is don't make assumptions about what the victim or survivor wants. Also, it's really important to keep them informed about what is happening. Because some investigations, given digital investigations, because of the resourcing implications and the volume, can take many months for the devices to be examined. And of course, so it's important by providing reassurance and giving victims confidence that we're constantly keeping them informed and up to date about the investigation. But if we're going to seize a victim's mobile telephone, then are we in a position as a police organisation to provide the victim with a replacement device? Because some people might not have access to other forms of communication. And if the police are going to keep the device for many months and the victim doesn't have the financial means to purchase or be provided with a replacement, how can that be managed? And victims and survivors will also want their telephones as a means of safety. They want to communicate with families and friends so they're not isolated without a device. So police officers and organisations need to be thinking of that as well. They also need to be thinking about, okay, so, about how are we going to harvest, how are we going to obtain the information, the evidence from the victim's phone. The police, when they're examining the victim's phone, have got to do it in a legal, proportionate, and accountable way. If the victim is saying, listen, this offending started on, say, the 1st of June 2026, and it's gone up to today's date, the 4th of June, or another date in the future, then why are the police officers potentially examining the phone for what happened between the 1st of January and, say, the 31st of May 2026? That's not proportionate and it's not legal. And neither does it give the victim confidence. When it comes to gender-based violence, the focus must be on the perpetrator's behavior, not trying to investigate gender-based violence and examining and seeking to investigate the behavior of the victim and survivor and how they have engaged or interacted with or communicated with other people. Okay, that is not a measure of being victim or survivor centered. So police investigators, and I would absolutely encourage police investigators, they must be perpetrator focused. The issue here is the perpetrator's behavior. The issue here is the perpetrator's offending. The issue here is the perpetrator's tablet, mobile telephone, computer network, and what they're saying and what they're doing and how they're using images and how they might be using AI in deep fake and fraudulent images. That's where the focus needs to be in that respect. But also, what we don't want investigators or frontline responders to do is, if it's digital offending, we don't want them picking up a device and then starting to play with it and think that they've got the personal skills to download material. Because by clumsily and awkwardly trying to do that, unless they are one of the tech experts, then they would be inadvertently destroying evidence. So the idea as a frontline investigator, your job is about seizing the devices, keeping those devices secure so that the tech experts can do it in the right tech way to maximize the harvesting of evidence. Only the people that are authorized as part of an investigation should be looking at the evidence in an investigation. That sits at the heart of the confidentiality, the privacy agreement, the investigation agreement. It sits at the heart of giving reassurance and confidence to the victim and survivor. A victim and a survivor does not want another community member or a family member of a law enforcement officer to approach them and say, ah, we know that you've reported been blackmailed to the police. We have seen you. Why have you been sending these images to someone? So the security, the retention of those mobile devices, and the wider content of the investigation, the access to that information must be limited. And if anyone who's unauthorized is then seeking to access, then they should be investigated and dealt with very seriously in their own organizations. So how devices are handled and how the evidence and information is handled, I think, is also absolutely of critical importance.